American Latino Studies and History, and I am one of the organizers of this event. I really need to thank my colleague Barbara Sostaita for bringing this event to us today and coming up with the idea and the importance and the timeliness. And I really want to offer thanks to all of you for being here on a very busy time of the semester, right in the middle of it. So today we have the opportunity to hear from a number of different perspectives about reimagining the city, migrant arrivals, and organizing in Chicago from both a historic and contemporary perspective. And this is going to be both presentations as well as discussion and conversation. So please, come up with questions, think of questions for the latter part of our session today. But I'm going to turn things over now to Linda Lopez, who is a doctoral student in sociology, also one of the longstanding members of our Latin American Latino Studies team, and to brag, was really one of fantastic students here in our master's program before she started the doctoral program, and also has a past life as a journalist. So, Linda, the floor is yours, and thank you again all for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I get a little shy. So just to give you a little bit more context about this panel, it kind of came about with, I was talking to Barbara last year, and I guess I've just been wondering a lot about how to connect what's happening in the city, in the larger country, with what we're doing here, especially in Latin American Latino studies. We spent so much time learning and talking about migration, reading about migration, and sociology as well. Like I'm touching upon those topics. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to have some sort of event where we're bringing people together, like scholars and also people that have been more involved in in a grassroots basis, to talk and just learn more about what's happening. What can we do? And there's just so many questions, and there's just so much happening in the world, and it's really hard to stay connected. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to do that. So I'm excited to learn also along with you all, because I think there's a lot that I still want to understand about what's happening. So that's a little bit of context. I'm really excited about this today. And to start things off, I'll give you bios for all our panelists, and then I'll hand it off to Xochitl Bada, who will start it off. Let's see. Xochitl Bada is an associate professor of Latin American Latino Studies. Her latest book, co-authored with Shannon Gleason, is Scaling Migrant Rights: How Advocates Collaborate and Contest State Power. This book analyzes how various organizations put tactical pressure on government bureaucracies to holistically defend migrant rights across U.S. cities where the Mexican Consular Network operates. Her first monograph, Mexican Hometown Associations in Chihuahua, I probably did not say that right, documents the fledgling movement of Hometown Association from the state of Michoacan in the city of Chicago, and how these organizations claim development rights back in their communities of origin. Soledad Alvarez Velasco is a social anthropologist and human geographer whose research analyzes the interrelationship between mobility, control, and spatial transformations across the Americas. She investigates the intersection between undocumented global South-North and global South-South transit migration, border regimes, the formation of migratory corridors across the Americas, and the migrant struggle across these transnational spaces. Anthony Storino, he grew up in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where he received his BA in Political Science and International Studies. He is currently pursuing an MA in Latin American and Latino Studies at UIC. Anthony's research investigates the prevalence of deterrence in the U.S. border regime. He analyzes government propaganda to understand how these communications can inform our understanding of U.S. border strategy. Anthony recently returned from Panama, where he participated in interviews with government officials and humanitarian workers, and visited migrant reception centers to talk with migrants and authorities on the ground to the Darien. Miguel Lopez. Miguel is a formerly undocumented organizer currently living in the southwest of Chicago. In OCAD, he focuses on membership development and using art as a tool for building people power. And last but not least, Jorge Mena. Jorge Mena Robles, he, they, was born in Guadalajara, Jalisco, and immigrated to the U.S. when he was 8 years old. Mena was first involved in an undocumented immigrant youth movement in Chicago via the formation of the Immigrant Youth Justice League, IJO, in 2009. Currently, he serves as the Associate Director of the UIC Latino Cultural Center. So these are all our wonderful panelists. So we're going to start it off with Xochitl Bada.
Thank you, Linda. And let me time myself because Adam told me that he really wanted this to be a conversation. And he gave me this tall order to talk about the history of migration to Chicago, Chicago as a city of migrants, and the resources available to migrants after arriving. So I hope that I can do justice in 10 minutes. Okay, this is why I prepare my remarks. And this is a tour of the city for 2 centuries. So kindly, I will remind you that Jean Baptiste Point du Sable is the founder of Chicago, and he was an immigrant of African descent, but is believed to have been a native of Santo Domingo, the Hispaniola island, which is now the Dominican Republic and Haiti. During the 1840s, Irish, German, and Scandinavian immigrants also arrived to the city. By 1850, more than half of the population in the city of Chicago was foreign-born. Today, about 20% of the total population in Chicago is foreign-born. Subsequent decades in the 19th and 20th century experienced the arrival of a diverse mix of immigrant populations from Europe, Latin America, the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa. In the 1850s, French immigrants came as political refugees fleeing the Revolution of 1848. In the 1860s, Scottish immigrants came to the city. 1870s, the Norwegian immigrants came in search of better work opportunities and settled in Logan Square, a neighborhood that today houses a sizable Latino population. In the 1880s, the Irish came to work in the construction of the canal connecting Chicago to the Illinois River, and they later settled in Bridgeport. By 1900s, Chicago had the fourth largest Irish population in the United States. In the 1900s, the Czechs from Bohemia came and settled in the Lower East Side, also known as Pilsen. The neighborhood takes its name from the Bohemian capital. These immigrants from Bohemia also established very robust organizations and even an opera house that is now Thalia Hall in Pilsen. I invite you all to go visit the Bohemian Opera House at Thalia Hall. Between 1920s and the 1940s, many Russians, Jews, flew persecution and settled around the Vaughan and East Rogers Park, which is now home to a large Latino, South Asian, and Indian population. Thousands of immigrants also came around that period from Sweden and Germany. This is also the period where Puerto Rican communities start coming to Chicago to pursue factory work. Between the 1915 and 1970s, also a massive similar but internal labor migration happened from the old Confederacy to the North, the West, and the Midwest. Over these 6 decades, 6 million African American Southerners left their birthplaces to spread across the country. They moved to New York, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and the smaller cities. Those who came to Chicago established primarily in Chicago's South Side, sharing space with Mexican immigrants who also lived in the South Side. And now let's move to Mexicans. Mexicans came in large numbers in the early 20th century. In fact, by the 1930s, the city of Chicago had 30,000 people from Mexico. They came to work in the steel mills in South Chicago and also in the railroad construction. They were fleeing Mexico's revolution. In the 1930s, many got deported during the repatriation period right after the Great Depression. In the 1950s, Chicago saw large groups of Polish settling in Bucktown, Westtown, and Archer Heights. The 1960s experienced a large Italian population settling nearby, here near UIC, in Little Italy. In the 1970s, Mexicans began arriving again in very large numbers and established distinctive neighborhoods by the very first time. This is a time when many decided to stay and no longer return or were back and forth between Mexico and the US. By 1965, Pilsen becomes the first Mexican gateway. In the 1980s, Filipinos also came in significant numbers thanks to the benefits afforded by the Immigration Act of 1965. Central American communities from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras also came in the 1980s because of the civil wars in their countries of origin, which were exacerbated due to the United States intervention in those wars. During the 1990s, Koreans also became important immigrants in Chicago, establishing in Albany Park, in North Park, and then moving to the suburbs, as many other previous immigrants did, such as the Bohemians who left Pilsen after the 1960s. After the 1970s, Mexicans began arriving without documents in large numbers, and this time because of this investment in the rural countryside in Mexico. It was a time when Mexico entered the global markets and sped up industrialization. During the 1980s, Mexicans were the main beneficiaries of the amnesty afforded by the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the so-called IRCA. But there was then a second wave of undocumented population who came after 1986 and no longer qualified for the amnesty because they missed the cutoff date. The integration of all these immigrant waves that I very succinctly told you about has not been easy in the city of Chicago, as each group has faced distinctive difficulties for integration, including language barriers, limited educational opportunities, discrimination, and racism. For example, many European peasants, such as the Polish, arrived with very low levels of education and did not speak any English upon arrival. In the last 2 centuries, many immigrants received support from various settlement houses and from sensible mayors such as Bohemian Mayor Anton Cermak. The Hull House, led by Jane Addams, here now also at UIC, was also an important avenue for integration. In there, immigrants were offered pottery classes, language lessons, civics, cooking, etc. The immigrant communities also receive support from their countries of origin through their consulates. With the support of their consuls, they form their own organizations. For the Mexicans, the first organization was the Benito Juárez Society in 1918. By the year of 1924, 12 Mexican organizations existed, including comisiones honoríficas, mutual aid societies, baseball clubs in the South Side, etc. By the year of 1925, the Confederación of Mexican Societies of the United States became an umbrella organization with 35 clubs. Many of those organizations dwindled during the Great Depression due to deportations. However, Mexicans and other immigrants have always been very active in city life, fighting for spaces of representation. In their long history in the city, they had experienced discrimination, and at times they have been considered scabs or strike breakers, depending on in what decade they came to work in the city. For example, the mutual aid societies for many immigrants were needed to alleviate the exclusion from union membership, which was frequent back then. Mutual aid societies help immigrants to access emergency funds for burial, sickness, or long-term savings. Those now exist in the form of, for example, Rotary Credit Associations. Many of you may have heard of tandas or cundinas, especially for those immigrants who do not have easy access to formal financial services. And these days, one of the very important contemporary forms of organizing among immigrants from Latin America is the figure of the hometown associations, which are clubs of immigrants from the same town of origin who get together to bring development back to communities of origin while making sure that the second generation maintains tradition, culture, and language. There are also indigenous groups that are very well organized, such as the Purépechas from the state of Michoacán, as well as uh, other ethnic organizations. Latin Americans also are very well organized through soccer. There is also, for example, the Chicago League of Soccer. This is a very important association called CLASA that boasts 300 soccer organizations from all Latin American clubs. And there are also cultural organizations such as mariachis, ballet folclóricos, and banda music. And finally, the other side of organizing that I also want to mention, and I will be happy to receive questions later on after hearing from other presenters, is ways of organizing through labor. Many of the worker centers nowadays in the city of Chicago, who serves large number of immigrants, not only Mexicans, but Polish, Irish, and other nationalities, are migrant-led. There are approximately 9 to 11 worker centers in the city, and they have very important leadership and representation from immigrants. And this is the ones that now, during the current newest arrivals to the cities, have been working very hard to produce systems of integration. And I will leave it here. My time is up, and I hope that I gave you a tour of what's going on in the past, in the present, for organizing in the city.
Okay, hi. Hi everyone. Today, Anthony and I will present to you the findings of what we have been working together, especially after we both went to Meteti, the province of Darien in Panama, and we will focus on the causes, the routes, and the experiences of global South migrants in transit to the US. So, in order to understand what happens with this huge amount of arrivals, we thought that it's important to understand what's going on at the Mexico-US border, because this border serves as a sort of thermometer in terms of what's going on in mobility and control across the Americas. If you see this data, in 2010, approximately 460,000 migrants were apprehended at the border. 80% were Mexicans, the rest were coming from different countries of Latin America, and the majority were single male adults. Only 13 years after, we have a new panorama at the border, and now you can see here that in 2023, just 13 years after, the number of people that arrive at the border have a five-fold surge compared to 2010. 2.5 million migrants have been apprehended, 1 million more than in 2021. Most of the encounters now involve people from other countries of this global south on top of Mexican and Central Americans. And a very relevant element is that not only single male adults are part of that amount of people that have been apprehended, but also families and children. So we have a new panorama here that of course needs to be explained. Anthony.
And here we can see a map of where people are coming from. You can see there's a proliferation of countries in Latin America, but there's also significant minorities coming from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. These are countries that are hit by impoverishment, armed and religious, political, and ethnic conflicts, and they have often been the subject of U.S. interventionism, and their nationals are forcibly displaced people who are entitled to seek international protection in the United States or elsewhere. You can see here the breakdown of where people are coming from. You can see Mexico is still the largest sending country, but it is not a majority. There's a lot of people coming from all over the place. ranging from Latin America through Asia and Africa as well.
So when we see those figures, the immediate question that comes is what happened over the past decade that has caused this exponential increase in the numbers of migrants in transit arriving to the US, right? So here, the importance is to understand that there is not only one cause to explain this incredible amount of people. In 13 years, the world has traversed, and this is something that we have to keep in mind, through a very complex period of pre-pandemic, pandemic, and post-pandemic. And this is a period in which all those countries of origin were already facing very complex and deep processes of crisis and a convergence of structural causes due to the effects of neoliberalism. Okay, so this is what is triggering those south-north mobilities to the US. When we say the exacerbation of the elements of neoliberalism during the pandemic, what we are talking about, and this is something that we should understand that is taking place on a global scale, growing inequality between and within regions. States have reduced their investment in health, education, and social protection systems, and the privatization of common assets. There has been an expansion of poverty. There has been an escalation of armed conflicts around the world, and of course, ecological devastation. And the numbers speak by themselves. You can see there that this multi-causal convergence of causes has produced an augment of forcibly displaced people in the past years. Now we have more than 109 million people that have been forced to flee out of their countries.
If we're looking at Africa and Asia, you can see that all of these causes are present there as well. But there's a key difference in that, like, Europe has traditionally been the place where people have sought asylum. However, it was a result of Fortress Europe policies, which forced migrants into very dangerous routes through the Mediterranean. African and Asian asylum seekers have diverted their routes to the American continent, mostly to South American countries who have more open border and pro-migrant policies. And so in the 21st century, South America has a new migratory pattern. It is no longer just a country ascending region, but it is increasingly a space of transit for Caribbean, African, and Asian migrants, and a space of forced returns from South American deportees.
Now, what has happened in Latin America in terms of the causes that are triggering those mobilities? Again, growing inequality within Latin American countries, the expansion of poverty, political instability, corruption, authoritarian governments. We also have internal conflicts within South American countries, Colombia as an example, but also Ecuador recently. Gender violence and the increase of feminicides. There's also a proliferation of violence at the hands of organized crime, ecological devastation on top of the changing in its migratory pattern that has changed the dynamics of Latin American countries.
Yes, and we want to highlight specifically Venezuelan migration, which has become a very large factor. Since 1999, 8 million Venezuelans, including children and adolescents, have fled the country, and this is the result of an intersection of causes. It's a result of the downfall in oil prices in a country where 90% of the economy is dependent on oil, is the result of U.S. economic sanctions and internal corruption and government mismanagement, especially since the death of Hugo Chavez. And then as a result of this influx of Venezuelans, Caribbeans, Asians, and Africans, since 2010 we have seen a selective and racist punitive turn, where restrictive immigration policies have proliferated throughout the region, confining migrants to irregularity, deportability, exploitation, and hyper-precaritization. There's also been blockages to asylum seekers, narrowing the routes to legal migration, increases in deportation across the regions, and a increase in restrictions on visas to global south countries, which makes it more difficult to get to Latin America and then traverse through it.
Now, we wanted also to share with you an important element that recently was published within the report, The Social Panorama of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, because it gives us another element to understand why South Americans and Caribbean are migrating in those huge numbers. In the post-pandemic crisis in Latin American countries, we are facing two important crises. A crisis in the right to decent work, and this means that 50% of the economic labor power is working between huge quotes in the informal market, confined to underemployment, and it's impeded to access any social security. There's an augment in truncated labor trajectories. There's an augment in school dropouts and an expansion of something that is called ninis, those young people that neither work nor study, the ones los que ni estudian ni trabajan. This is a population between 15 and 24 years old that are like a sort of floating population that are a target nowadays to be co-opted by narco gangs that are proliferating also in South America especially. So this element is a very important piece of information to understand why people are fleeing out of South America on top of a crisis in human security. There's an escalation of criminalized violence, and there's an escalation of a fact that is critical, living among vacunas. What are vacunas? The extortions that narco gangs or criminalized organizations are implemented as a way of living in the region. And this, as you can see here in this map, Latin America now is the most violent region in the world, and those countries that we have highlighted with those pins are the most important sending countries to the U.S., being Ecuador nowadays the most violent country in the world. So this also connects what we were discussing before regarding who's coming to the U.S.
Yes. So what we see is a convergence of structural causes, crises, and a deterioration of living conditions. And added to that is social hostility and racism against migrants and countries of exception. Added to that is reinforcement of regional anti-migrant practices. To add to that, rumors of potential openness in the United States. And the idea of the American dream is kind of like a pulling factor as well. And what we're seeing as a result is the exponential augment of south to north irregularized transit to the United States. And under these conditions, we have to understand transit, we have to understand migration as a strategy to sustain lives. It's a survival tactic. It's a politics of life. And here you can see some images of people moving through the region. You can see the notable presence of children and families, as well as the conditions people are going through.
Now, it's important also to understand that south-north transit migration, as Xochitl was already saying, is not a new phenomenon in the Americas. In the past 5 decades, Colombians have migrated por el Hueco, Ecuadorians por la Chacra. What happened? Just as Mexicans, Caribbeans, and Central Americans have been transiting. What's new now, it's the volume. Also, Asian and African migrants have been also transiting from south to north using the Andean region as a connecting hub to the Americas since the 1970s. So, Anthony, you will explain what's new.
So what is new, like we just said, is the volume of people moving and the countries of origin from which people are coming from. Additionally, what else is new is the reinforcement of visa regimes, which makes it more difficult to migrate in the first place and forces people to take more diverse routes that are more dangerous. Also, what is new is this Ecuador, Colombia, Panama regional transnational transit area, especially Panama, a place where people are kind of being funneled into. The presence of children and families is new, as well as the fact that the vast majority of people in transit are forcibly displaced people, and this is oftentimes not their first or only migration. It's their second, their third migration. Sometimes they migrate internally and then migrate across borders. And so as a result, people are forced to live their lives in transit. It's kind of transit after transit, this form of permanent itineracy between countries, migratory conditions, communities, and this leaves deep scars, physical, mental, and emotional.
We wanted to quickly share with you the experience of Dennis. He is a migrant from Ecuador who I met here in Chicago. Just look at how many places he traversed before arriving in Chicago, 23 localities. But the interesting thing in his migratory trajectory is that before departing Ecuador, he had already moved internally because of vacunas. He was being extorted in Ecuador. Only then he decided to move. And this is an example of what does it mean to live in transit. It's a new phenomena that, as Anthony was saying, is totally changing. Wait, we didn't. Oh, here it is.
Sorry about
The 23 locations that he traversed in 3 months before arriving to Chicago.
Yes, and
Okay.
sorry. And so we can see that in the past decade, Panama has turned into one of the most dynamic transit spaces across the Americas. In 2010, about 550 people crossed the Darien in Panama. In 2023, 521,000 people had crossed. And you can just see the exponential increase in people moving through this region. You can see that people were already moving, but it is at a completely different scale than it was before. And here are just the breakdown of the numbers of people moving and where they are coming from.
In terms of routes, very quickly, it's important to understand that depending on the visa that migrants have to get, and it's also part of U.S. remote control across the region, migrants will use different air, sea, or land routes. It's a contingent journey, and here you can see the diversification of routes depending where are you coming from. Example, if you come from Asia or Africa, you would use Brazil, Ecuador, or even Panama, Nicaragua to enter the Americas and then follow by land up to the US. Same is true if you want to take a sea route from San Andres, Colombia, then to Nicaragua, then up to the US. And maybe the most complex route, as you can see here in the map, is the land route. That means that migrants are crossing by land, many times by foot, the whole hemisphere just to reach the US. And something important is to understand that there's $1 million profit that is distributed among the multiple actors that are operating across those land, air, and sea routes, contributing to an economic reactivation of the hyper precarious border economies across the region.
And so we wanted to highlight the extremely difficult conditions under which people are migrating, the lack of state protection. Oftentimes border regions are in the hands of criminal actors, indebtedness. It is extremely, extremely expensive to make this journey, especially as families are coming. There is a cost at every single step along the way. And along the way, you're constantly experiencing human rights violations. There's a potential for accidents as you're traveling. People are confined to overcrowded waiting places in inhumane conditions, which you can see some of the photos that we took in Panama where people are staying. The lucky people are staying in tents, and those who are less lucky are staying in these black plywood buildings that the UN has provided, which it's very, very hot in Panama. It's very, very difficult conditions people are staying under. Additionally, they're subject to robberies and extortion, to physical, sexual, and psychological violence, especially women and children, which often goes unreported and or unpunished. And we have to remember that in this context, migrants are strengthening strategies of group organization and collective self-care to stay alive along these routes. And you can see there's been a large number of missing migrants as well, over 9,000 missing migrants since 2014, with the major sites of disappearances and deaths being the U.S.-Mexico border and the second highest being the Caribbean-U.S. border. And you can see that the number of disappearances and deaths is much higher in this post-pandemic period. And so, to wrap up, we wanted to just touch on why is it important to learn about these global south transit migrants arriving in Chicago from the U.S.-Mexico border.
So we think it's important because we need to historicize this flow and understand its complex convergence of causes,
We need to deconstruct this prevailing narrative perpetuated in public discourse and media around transit migration, fueled by an anti-immigrant invasion and crisis rhetoric.
Also, to understand the role of the U.S. in instigating these irregularized transits, whether as the legacy of interventionist policies or as part of reinforced externalization of U.S. borders in the region. And finally,
to gain insights from migrant experiences and to learn from their tireless struggle and capacity to reinvent strategies of group organization and collective self-care. This is pivotal in any efforts to shape a more inclusive city committed to social justice.
thank you.
Thank you all.
Hi everyone, my name is Jorge Mena. As Linda said, I came to the US when I was 8 years old. And I think you left us up in the right place. Speaking of migrant experiences, I was asked to share a little bit about the organizing connections to UIC, undocumented organizing connections to UIC. So to start things off, I'll take us back to 2010. Back in 2010, the DREAM Act was up for Congress to review it, to see if the Congress would approve the DREAM Act. Raise your hand if you've heard about the DREAM Act. Raise your hand if you've heard about DACA. Great. That helps. That saves some time. Here at UIC, we have a handful of undocumented students. The reason that a lot of undocumented students, including myself at the time, come to UIC is because it's one of the most affordable options in the entire city. And so a lot of us end up going to community college and then transferring to UIC to finish our bachelor's. Back in 2010, one of my close friends named Rigo Padilla, we went to high school together, we went to Harold Washington together, and then we went to UIC together. He got detained on his way home. Immediately, this is 2010, right? So this is pre-DACA. Immediately got placed into deportation proceedings. I remember him giving me a call the day he had gotten released with an ankle monitor, telling me what had happened. And I think as he shared what happened, myself and a lot of us thought it happened to Rigo, but it could have happened to any of us. That immediately mobilized a lot of the undocumented folks and allies within Chicago, within UIC, and pretty soon within the larger country. In order to stop Rigo's deportation, we embarked on a campaign and we started an organization called the Immigrant Youth Justice League, or IJL. Xochitl mentioned the Whole House as a place that a lot of migrants have traversed, a lot of services they've provided. The first meeting that we had was actually at the Whole House. It was a meeting to come together to talk about, for undocumented people from across the city, undocumented young students, to come together to, one, talk about the DREAM Act, and two, think about how we can actively support Rigo's campaign. That meeting turned into none of that. It turned into a conversation where around 20 undocumented young people sat in these round tables, and one by one we started sharing our stories. I'm undocumented, this is how it's impacting me, this is how it's impacting my family and my access to education, and so on and so forth. That happened to be the first time that most of us, almost all of us, had shared our undocumented status in a public setting with strangers. I say that because I think it really ignited what came to be the undocumented youth movement within the country, and it happened right here at the Whole House at UIC. I think having shared our stories, we quickly realized that that story sharing could be used as a political tool to build community, to affect change. I think a lot of us who came to this country as young people, we had sat in these classrooms talking about immigration with our professors, with our teachers, knowing that if we didn't tell someone we were undocumented ourselves, they would have no idea, right? We could pass in some ways. And so in some ways, because we also grew up here, we knew that we've heard about the suffrage movement, we heard about civil rights, we heard about the LGBT movement, that there was an opportunity to activate ourselves in some way, right? To know that we could be political actors in our own struggle, even though we couldn't vote, etc. And so the Immigrant Youth Justice League that came to fruition through UIC in Chicago pushed for the DREAM Act, pushed and organized for the first coming out of the shadows, which happened in March 2010, March 10th, 2010, over in Daly Plaza downtown, where undocumented people shared their stories. This culminated in a march from Union Park all the way to downtown Chicago. And I remember before we stepped off, we had gotten word from folks that were setting up the stage, etc., that there were already ICE vans at Daly Plaza. That the people who were doing that part let us know that that was happening, and then let us know what do you guys want to do, right? Especially those of you who were going to share their stories on stage about being undocumented. Folks decided to move forward. I wish I had some photos, because a lot of the photos from that march, you see people wearing their UIC hoodies and holding that huge undocumented and unafraid banner all the way to downtown Chicago. So that was in 2010. The DREAM Act came up for a vote. It failed. It did not pass. The theme of that first coming out of the shadows was undocumented and unafraid. The following year, 2010, the word unapologetic was added to that theme, in part because so many of us who arrived when we were young, pushing for the DREAM Act, had heard through the media, through every interview we did, well, you all are okay. It's your parents' fault. You were 8 years old, your parents were the ones who made the decision. And so the adding of unapologetic, especially after the DREAM Act failed yet again, was in response to that, right? Was to say to the larger community, to say to the larger nation, we're not going to apologize for our parents bringing us to this country. And we're not going to allow you to vilify our parents for making these decisions. So that was 2010, 2011. Pretty quickly, the undocumented youth movement went from petitioning, from speaking to legislators in Congress and building support throughout our communities, to coming out and sharing our stories, to eventually coming to using civil disobedience as a tactic. I won't go too much into the civil disobedience because, I think that could be its own 10-minute conversation. But one thing that I will say is that one of the lessons learned through that early movement was that for a lot of us that were doing that work, not only were we undocumented, but we also happened to be queer. And I don't think that that was by chance, right? I think, and this is what my master's for MA, I looked at Xochitl, but this is what my master's in Latin American Latino Studies was about, sort of talking to some of those early activists about coming out of the shadows, coming out of the closet, those connections and their identity formation. But I think we quickly realized that it was impossible to compartmentalize our lives, right? We have to navigate these multiple intersecting identities in all of our spaces. And I think that also helped with the civil disobedience as well. Back in 2010, you saw the first act of civil disobedience by undocumented youth in Senator John McCain's office. Senator John McCain, late Senator John McCain, was chosen as the first place for undocumented people to do civil disobedience because he had originally said he would vote for the DREAM Act and then took that back. And so undocumented people around the country were like, nah, girl. Like, we're going to go to your office and, like, hold you accountable. And that's when you also saw some of the tactics developing, which I would call good immigrant tactics, of undocumented young people doing civil disobedience, wearing caps and gowns, which sends a message of we grew up in this country, we have our education, and so on and so forth. Which I think at the time the conversation wasn't yet happening about how that sort of messaging, what impact that had in terms of compartmentalizing who deserves adjusting their status, who deserves American citizenship. In 2011, we had a civil disobedience also right around the corner in response to Secure Communities. Secure Communities was a program that would have allowed local police to fingerprint anyone they stopped and to share that information with ICE, which would lead to more racial profiling. And so we had a walkout from that federal hearing, and we also participated in civil disobedience. 2 minutes already. The other thing that I'll highlight is, along with this building this picture, is that Lulu Martinez in 2013, who was a UIC student, was one of 9 undocumented youths who purposely attempted to cross the US-Mexico border without a visa and then requested asylum after they were denied entry. This was called the Dream 9 action. They were released after 2 weeks in detention, which is not a very long time in comparison to some of the other stories you've likely heard, and that was because of protests and political pressure. And then the last thing I'll add to that piece was that same year that Lulu crossed the border with these 8 other people was when FUA, the Fearless Undocumented Alliance, which is a student organization at UIC, was created by undocumented students. A couple of things that I'll wrap up with. I think after I got my own work permit, I realized that a lot of the undocumented youth organizers, their priorities were shifting, right? And that's because it was the first time that they had access to a legal work permit. And so not only did having access to a work permit through DACA increase the surveillance that undocumented young people had in this country, but it also had an impact on the direct organizing that was happening. So priorities shifted, people started going to work, practicing their degrees if they had them. And then IJO turned into OCAD, which Miguel will talk about, the Organized Communities Against Deportation, which also further the tactics and the strategies to focus more on stopping deportations for people that are not those good immigrants, right? People who have DUIs and so on and so forth. All right, great. I think, so as we think about recent migrant arrivals, a couple things that I'm thinking about. Chicago is in population decline. Major cities are in population decline. And yet, for some reason, these migrant arrivals are not seen as an opportunity, right? That we need more young workers in this country. A lot of what we're talking about is not new. The immigration waves are not new. Similarly, when a Democratic president is running for re-election, we also see sort of the similar things happening, which is that comprehensive immigration reform continues to be delayed. Right now, we're seeing new bills that include like border enforcement, but nothing in terms of DACA, nothing in terms of helping current migrants, which I think is really important to highlight. The other thing that I'm thinking about is another example that we have of recent migrants are Ukrainians, right? We're talking about 30,000 Ukrainians since the war started who have come to Chicago, and none of them are staying or sleeping in police station or homeless shelters. They've been integrated successfully into the economy. They've received Medicaid, supplemental security income, temp housing, job counseling, because Biden added in the budget for for Ukraine, included $600 million to integrate Ukrainians. And so what I'm thinking about is where is the will to do this for Latin Americans in this same way? I think that is something for us to continue to keep thinking about, and why has there never been this sort of investment or infrastructure to make sure immigrants can resettle at the U.S. at a federal level?
Seems right. Last but not least, Miguel Lopez.
Hi everyone. Thanks for inviting me, and also thank you, Jorge, for like sharing about kind of like the pre OCAD era, and like the organization that I'm representing is Organized Communities Against Deportations. Like Jorge Mena said, it came out of like young undocumented folks back in the 2010-11. Officially, OCAD became established, whatever, like in 2013, and also Jorge coined the term, FYI, and kind of like with that focus of like making sure that we're talking about criminalization as we talk about immigration, because we folks decided that we wanted to focus directly in that intersection and like stopping deportations, specifically of people that had criminal convictions. Because we don't believe that we should buy into the narrative of like good immigrants versus bad immigrants, and so I think that's something that we decided to focus on. At that time, Obama was in office. In the undocumented community, he's known as the deportator in chief, and so it was like a big important thing to do to challenge that, and I think for us, as we continue to do individual campaigns where we're like supporting an individual alongside sharing the tools of like how to fight a deportation, how to challenge their case, and being able to stay with their community. At the same time, we tie them to like broader issues in Chicago that affect not just undocumented people, but like everyone, like the issue of surveillance, They show like over policing in black and brown neighborhoods, and so yeah, there's different cases that I can touch upon. I think one of them like that became like a campaign that we're currently working on along with other organizations in the city is to get trying to get rid of the database, the gang database that the Chicago Police Department has. For us, it's a tool of surveillance that one is not helpful. There's no proof that it can help with crime, etc. And at the same time, it's luring people into different types of harm. In our case, that information gets shared with ICE and 500 other agencies, which leads to deportations. And so that's sort of like to give an example of like the type of campaigns that we support. Yeah, I think that's in a way something that we try to do a lot, the narrative change with the recent arrivals, the folks that have been coming since August 2022 here in Chicago. Um, we have done different things, initiatives. One thing is that we opened up like a mutual aid fund where people were wanted if they wanted to donate, they could donate, or foundations as well. And we just went out to police districts to distribute that money in cash. Barbara has come with us in the past, and so far since August 2022, we've been able to redistribute 125,000. Sounds like a lot, but it's very little. And another thing that we're doing is we're like challenging, as you touched upon, the tensions between not just like already underserved communities, black and brown communities in Chicago with the recent arrival folks, but also within migrant communities. There's a lot of we're seeing a lot of tensions and a lot of xenophobia as well. And so one something that we've been doing is doing workshops at the shelters through like a partnership with another organization where we kind of like share what we're doing and also like share tools so that they can organize themselves. I think that's something important to highlight for them. And also specifically I'm going to talk about like in Wadsworth. I don't know if you heard about the shelter that used to be a school that they shut down. It was a school that had been already shut down for like many years. The community was fighting for it in a predominantly black neighborhood in Woodlawn, and there was constantly like in the news and stuff about like the tensions and the anti-immigrant sentiments and like why are you helping them versus not us. And so that together with like other black organizations in the community, we've been doing like canvassing, talking to people about like how yes, listening to that's definitely something real, like those tensions that they're highlighting of like why how come now there's resources for like shelters, etc. And at the same time, we think that this is a moment where we can both win, where we can demand bigger things for everyone, not just immigrants or already living people that are already living in Chicago. And so we've been doing that sort of canvassing and stuff. And honestly, what we've been finding is that there's a lot more like solidarity and unity than what gets highlighted in the media for obvious reasons. Like, and so yeah, those are some of the things that we've been able to support. I think also it's important to highlight that there's so many mutual aid efforts and so many organizations that are doing so much on the ground. When the police districts were being used as like homes for people that were arriving, there was like thousands of people that were plugged into the mutual aid supports. And so I think like that's something that we always emphasize, that people like getting together in your own community with your own people, like there's so many happening already, that I think it's something beautiful to see, like so many like autonomous projects. um, and similar to something that I also wanted to highlight what you just said was Jorge, that I know.
I know you know
that
my name.
that is like there's so much rage against like this very little funds that the millions that people are talking about in the media that from the city that are going to like the migrants, but the reality is that they're going to like these companies like Garda World, to the favorite staffing, which honestly they're like from Texas, they're from different places, and it's not necessarily going to the people directly impacted. So I think we're facing like a lack of creativity from local officials, and also lack of like political will, because like we don't believe that shelters is the answer either, because those places are so like crowded. There's like so many tensions inside. People are depressed. People are like having to be there 24/7, and it's like and it's like the expectation that, oh, but when are you getting your work permit so that you can start working, whatever. It's like that's not realistic, and like knowing how backlogged are all of the processes, etc. Knowing that not everybody's gonna apply for asylum, not everybody's gonna apply for TPS or be eligible. That's what I mean. That's something that we need to contend with. And for us, another threat that we see is that like many of these people eventually are gonna be deported or like in deportation proceedings. Many of them are already in deportation proceedings, having to check in with ICE, having to check in with CBP, etc. And so that's something that yeah, there needs to be like more at the federal level, more support similar to like what has been provided to Ukrainians, but just in general, like we need to stop investing in like wars, which only creates more displacement, more migration, and so yeah, I think that's some things that I wanted to share.
I think we're gonna open it up to questions. So the way it's gonna work, so just raise your hand and I'll try to get to everyone. I guess I'll start here.
So I'm really curious. I'm really curious about how you think what's happening now with new arrivals. Like, what do you think the impact is going to be with the immigrant rights movement?
So the question was, with all the new recent migrant arrivals, what do we think will happen to the immigrant rights movement? I would say the first thing that comes to mind for me is my head is so UIC centered at this moment and like education centered that I think some of what comes to mind is the opportunity. What will happen to all the young people that are arriving in terms of once they enter the education school system and the impact that will have, and hopefully the opportunity that will also garner for young migrants in this country, right? I think undoubtedly there's already a population shift because of the flow has changed so dramatically of who's coming. But as I talked about undocumented young people sort of creating this movement from the ground, right? I imagine that there will be more opportunity for that. But that's where my immediate mind went.
Sorry, I just wanted to say something real quick to your question. My name is Cindy, everyone. I'm actually here with two migrant youth organizers from Venezuela, and we are part of an organization called Royal, where we have 15 to 21-year-old organizers, about 10 Venezuelan youth organizers. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, and to your point, Jorge, around schools, is that I think, well, from what I've observed, obviously I have a very limited scope, but they are right away very much organizing against the schools, right? So I think in the past, schools have been a kind of a vehicle for activism, whereas the young people that are arriving now are kind of arriving and already like, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't feel right, and trying to figure out how to, change. Obviously, I don't know if they have other perspectives. They don't speak English.
Just to repeat the question for no, that's okay. Like she was asking, what are the different inside and outside strategies in terms of like like migrant organizing, or how to address the issues that are arising?
Thank you. I would say thank you for that question. Like, I think something in terms of like outside strategies that we're working on. I can't speak too much of it because of the legality of it, but there is, along with neighbors in the in Albany Park area, we're collaborating with other organizations like Latino Union, APDN, Albany Park Defense Network, the Council for Homeless in Chicago. There's like people from Chicago that are houseless, and along with 3, 4 families that recently arrived migrants, we're thinking of exploring. There's this state statute that talks about non-for-profits being able to, like, if there's abandoned buildings in the house in the neighborhoods, you can sort of like put up a letter of like, hey, we noticed this has been abandoned. If you don't take any actions within 30 days, we're gonna take you to court. And eventually, it's kind of like reclaiming land that is being unused. And so we're in the process of exploring that. And also, yeah, like we think that like if houses are not being used, that's a potential. And that's what we've been like when um the administration is lacking creativity because there's about 33,000 houses that are empty in Chicago currently, and we think that those could be revitalized by people, by the state, etc., to be able to house people. And so for us, that's like a key component of that, and obviously like thinking in even in different ways of like owning land, like collectively owning land versus trying to get the landlord to like fix it up, etc. And so that's like one of the strategies that we see. In terms of like inside, like I think like and yes, like a former member of OCAD is part of the join like one of the positions in the administration, right? Like I think that's important to note. Also, we don't necessarily like collaborate in that sense. It's more like we push them to try to like take actions into things, and like we're definitely like against like the 10 cities that Mayor Branson is proposing. Like, like we don't think that's a humane thing to do, and so we're more of like pushing them to do the right thing. Yeah.
I guess really quickly, what I would add to your question, Naomi, is that because of because we're in Chicago, because of the history of organizing here, we do have an infrastructure of organizations and networks to provide services to the existing undocumented community, right? And so I think as we received more migrant arrivals, maybe this isn't the best way to say it, but I think Chicago was one of the best places that migrants could have landed in comparison to some other large cities. And I say that knowing that also coordination is so crucial for all of these efforts. I mean, so many people are doing this work, and for recent arrivals, we're thinking about the Restoration Project and the link that they have with USCIS, right? It has to be a very streamlined, effective process where we have clinics with biometrics, criminal background checks, along with other community orgs serving as first responders, ICERs doing case management, people doing job placement, city, all these things, right? And so, and I recently attended something similar where Ede from the Restoration Project talked, and I was like, man, Ede was one of these young undocumented people who was like learning how to organize, and now they're doing so much of this work for the Resurrection Project, right? And so I think that speaks to some of the internal, like, because we're in Chicago, this is the kind of response that we can gather, and which may or may not be happening in other major cities.
What I would like to add that I saw here this week in this Alianza Americas has been organizing rounds of discussions about precisely this issue, and it was very illuminating to me to say that in her case, it's very painful and also very joyful to be able to be at the forefront of this effort, because her own family, she comes from an undocumented family, so she sees this as a great opportunity, as you were saying, that we should not forget the fact that the state of Illinois has 460,000 undocumented individuals that are not getting the parole, like parole or TPS or any emergency situation status. So this is more than ever super important to create this unity among those new arrivals with those who have been left behind. For again, 460,000 in the state of Illinois without documentation, which there is no plans from the federal government to be able to offer at least parole, TPS, on work permits, etc. So it's a great moment for the youth like Jorge, Noca, and Nere, and all those who are now the leaders of the movement to be able to bring the best minds to keep on pushing for the federal government to offer some sort of relief to undocumented to have been here for 40 years now. The elderly population of undocumented is growing exponentially. In the latest count, there were like 30% of that number of 460,000 are elderly, more than 65 years of age, and they do not qualify for the Medicaid and all those services precisely because of lack of for not being for being undocumented, and that's because of what since IRCA we haven't had any other possibilities of legalization. So I just wanted to share that, like that, how much Ere has been working with the TPS and the work permit. So if you want to volunteer, there is a marathon, and I encourage everybody to volunteer with the Resurrection Project.
I tried to help on that effort. So if you don't have to have that very mistake, there's the time and willingness to go to support the direction of the cities and activating what can provide them with things that are needed, but actually materializing each and every one of them is very clear time in particular.
Yeah, okay. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
I have one about, I'll try to suggest.
I have one about the post-pandemic presentation. So, how are y'all determining what is post of the pandemic? Is it legislative? Is it more based on like vaccine accessibility or like rate of death slowing? Like, how are y'all differentiating between pandemic and post-pandemic?
Post-pandemic, we were able to prevent natural calamity when states started to lift their restrictions on mobility.
Even though the pandemic continues to affect their lives.
And then it's important to understand that different times in terms of analyzing what happened before, what happened during, and what's coming afterwards, to see the dimension of improving our process and converting the crisis.
Other questions?
I guess I'll try to project too. I guess like we've all seen how like the media kind of like portrays the whole like immigrant and migrant influx, and I feel like obviously that kind of influences the hostility that we've seen with a lot of communities. So I guess like my question is like, how do we start to slowly alleviate those tensions and like those ideas that are kind of already being implemented in the media? I guess it's more so like, how do we start alleviating it through our families and through our communities?
You're asking about how to alleviate tension that
I mean, like, I'll share a little bit. Like, I think you talked about like with your family and members and stuff like that. Like, I mean, honestly, like, just straight up, like, calling them out in the moment, because I feel like, and yeah, I feel like this city in Chicago, there's, at least in my experience being Mexican, there's like a lot of the migration is very focused on Mexicans, and like it's Mexican centric, and like even that comes with its tensions and like its own, like, in a way, racism, xenophobia, where there's also like kind of like I've heard comments of like, oh, they're getting this and that, but we're not getting anything, and like I understand those sentiments, where they're coming from. That yeah, but at the same time, it's kind of like questioning, like, if you're talking about like TPS, you clearly saw that Biden just like signed something and now extended TPS to like thousands of people. Can we demand that? Like, are you, like, how would, I think for me it's like an invitation for them to be active in their struggle. And I know that it's difficult because, like, yeah, we're working and we're busy, etc. But like, I think for me it's like it can be used also like a wake up call for family members. So like, we can also be organized and like demand things that like are so easily that could become reality. And also, there's other feelings of like, oh, I struggle a lot, why then you don't have to struggle? It's like challenging the things, but like, do you really expect that, like, because you struggle, you want others to struggle? Like, how can we more like create a more humane path for folks that are that need to migrate to another place, etc. So I think for me, like, having those conversations, like asking more questions and going deeper could help. And again, like inviting them to participate, to like get to know them, to like talk to folks. I think it's important.
I would answer your question, but I think it's a very important question. And how can we spread the word out regarding the life experiences of all these new migrants that are arriving in Chicago? It means research, as we said, how do we show the history of those mobilities? How do we show the causes within the mobilities? And how do we construct country narratives in public spaces like this one, but also outside and going to the community to learn which migrant and non-migrant in terms of building these new narratives so we can combat fatigue and these ideas in which we have multiplied places like this. That might be a possibility because together with graduate organizations.
Echoing what you said. Additionally, from like, I think it's kind of microapproach where we individually and an individual try to combat these narratives. I think it's extremely important that we pressure our representatives. As Jorge was talking about, Democrats have kind of had this recent border security bill, which does not actually contain any provisions for migrant services, but it's just border security bill. And this kind of capitulation to this anti-migrant rhetoric is extremely dangerous. Having a two-party system as ours, having both parties forming this consensus, anti-migrant consensus, is extremely dangerous. And so I'd recommend to everybody write, to call, to pester your representative in every way to ensure that they do not support this pivot.
I would say at a basic level, right, to summarize, I think what we're all thinking is to highlight the stories of the people that we're talking about, right? When we're talking about the already existing undocumented community, so as what you said, over 400,000 people. We're 2 or 400. Like, this is nothing, right? And I think same with the migrant arrivals. I think having helped in those workshops, right? Like, you see so many families, and I think when you see all these little ones and these families, you can't help but to see the humanity at play, right? Which I think, as I say this, I recognize that it's a tall order for some in the current state of affairs, because you talked about media, right? Like, up is down and down is up, and fake news. Like, it just feels immensely difficult right now. But I think for that reason, it really requires each of us to continue to highlight those stories and to respond to those stereotypes, right? Yeah, I mean, to this day, I still have conversations with people who still think that undocumented people don't pay taxes, right? Like property taxes, sales taxes. I'm like, if I could go to the grocery store and be like, actually, don't charge me these taxes. Like that's not the world we're living in. So like in whatever way we can push back against those stereotypes. And I think to the tensions that you brought up, right? At that workshop, that's what she was talking about. The question got asked, like, how do you respond to current undocumented people who where tensions are building with new arrivals? And I think that's a really important conversation for us to have, because sure, USCIS is prioritizing these applications, which may or may not cause challenges with other approvals. But I think, as you said, as Miguel said, right, we have to advocate for funding for work permits that are inclusive for the entire undocumented community, those that are already existing and those newly arrived peoples. Yeah.
Wanted to add a little bit. So I resonate with the storytelling, especially like from my journalism background. I'm always looking for like avenues for where migrant stories are being told, and I think there's a few good examples, like Borderless in Chicago, Borderless magazine. They have a website, and I think they're doing really good reporting on migrants in Chicago. That's probably one of the ones I go to. I think Blog Club also has some really good stories sometimes on like migrants in Chicago. I think with like the disintegration of media, there are less outlets that I'm seeing that are very thorough and like covering what's happening. But I think Chicago still has some bright spots and in being able to cover like what's happening in a thorough way. And another point that came to mind was like how to alleviate the tensions. I always wonder like what's causing the tensions, and I feel like this othering is really prevalent. And I thought about it. I was on the Halsted bus on Sunday, and I passed the migrant shelter like on around Cermak and Halsted, and you just see so many people outside, and I don't know. It made me think a lot about how, like the policies of housing people, like thousands of people in these shelters, and pushing them in the margins only kind of perpetuates the cycle of othering them and makes them easier to attack, makes people feel like they're not like me. So I guess I was just thinking a lot about that as I was passing, and then the bridge with the that you still see like candles, and I think it was like flowers for I think it was the 9-year-old that 5 years old that passed away in the shelter, on that same shelter in December. So I think there's a lot to be said about how there's this perpetual othering, and it makes it easier to kind of like just, I don't know, like leave, or makes it harder to alleviate those tensions that exist. So yeah, I just wanted to add that things that I think just thinking about something that I was thinking about on Sunday.
I want to dovetail what you're saying. Uh, what stuck to me is that when the people say politicians are not very creative, but we are, and we don't have to keep quiet. And if we have ideas, share them. When my brother, who I love him dearly, starts talking Republican to me, I go, don't mess with me. I said, do not mess with me, because we're sitting in different positions. He's in a, what do you call it, rich community, gated community, horrible community. And then, so I said, don't mess with me. Don't start with your Trumpy, because we are in different trenches. You cannot compare. So right now, all of us, the way that we can magnify what we learn or what has been rekindled in our hearts because we lived the history, is to be creative and submit these creative ideas. When I crossed a lot of the Halsted, everybody talks about that Halsted. I see the park districts, Harrison Park, Zapata Park that we call, lacks trees. A lot of people would be healthier and happier if they would be planting trees. So, get the big or companies, art or institutions, let's get the Chicago Botanical Garden, come on, help and get people planting, considering that all their beautiful park gardens are done by migrant workers. We have, and I know my program has heard it before, we have, it's not the older maybe politicos are not creative because they're reaching out to us now that they're feeling that they're going to lose their position. Do you have any ideas? Yes, share your ideas. But most importantly, you have to be active getting the vote out, because people say, no, I'm not going to vote this, I'm not going to vote with this because, they're not good, they forget, they're older, whatever. No, don't sit back. If you really feel what we're talking about, Be active. In Pilsen, they do a lot of posting, educating, posting the George Floyd poster and talking to people, educating, being creative in the park district rather than wasting a lot of money with concerts. Create opportunities where people can volunteer and work together. Combine blacks and browns. It hurt me to see the Chinese community beating up on a new good older person that we had. And I was say, and then another persons that we have to, that they're not very creative, that they are parrots, are the media, that they will repeat the same story. The older person got beat up or whatever, but nobody addresses, what's the problem. They're forgetting where they came from or how they helped or whatever. Be creative. There's a lot of avenues. In Pilsen, where you live, they have a poetry event. And I listened to it the other day, and it was beautiful. It's storytelling. It's done with music, so we can do storytelling. There's a lot of people here that have contacts with different communities and different resources. We just need to be louder. It's a time to be participatory and share the creativity more than criticizing, mobilize, because again the resources are there. We have projects happening with the partnership with Argonne, that they're checking out into all this what would you say, polluted communities like Pilsen, like Villita, like Brighton Park, like on the north side, on the south side, on the west side. Put pressure on the politicos by voting, exercising your vote. And your vote, guess what? It doesn't come out automatically. It's best when people go and knock on doors and talk to one another. And then you become activated. Gracias.
Hi. I'm a urban education major here, and I was kind of wondering from my perspective as someone who's going to be working in the city school system, what those of us who are going to be educators can do to address this situation, if anything.
Yeah.
So but I cannot speak from the agricultural perspective. So there are educators who are taking it, and the best way is to involve all those groups and get them out and organize and support and be like on the one-on-one session engagement and then the exercise. Here's what more geographic zone where kids can walk by or walk towards each other and organize. That's the way we're work. Because we'd like to hear when you recall the numbers and the country environment and it's also important to think about the language barrier. Because it's not only Spanish speaking people that are arriving, but also Western speaking people that are coming from indigenous communities and non-indigenous about all the other indigenous communities in Central America and Mexico. We have people from the East, we have people coming from Brazil, speaking Portuguese, we have people coming from Africa, speaking French, Portuguese. So there's a niche of surpassing and traversing the language barrier, which is huge, and that's something that should have been discussed within the department, like how schools become multilingual. Now we can do a incredibly diverse, global size in the U.S. and particularly in the U.S.
Something that came to mind is like thinking about how I portray the organizing and the social productions comes to mind. I think it was kind of a way that where I don't know if you know about it or not. I'm sure there's teachers there that maybe have like lessons and some sort of activities for some of the migrant students. I feel like there's probably a lot of teachers out there that have been dying some sort of activities for the migrant students. I just teacher reporting sometimes you're reading stuff about like migrants in school experience, actually, but also I don't find any support teachers that are really involved. I feel like there's probably a lot going on that we probably don't know much about, but yeah, I think there's probably ways to find that through like different organizations.
I would say again at a basic level, affirm them, right? Make space for processing. Someone who moved from Mexico to the U.S. when I was in the middle of third grade. It was because of my English language teacher that I think I was able to adjust in the way that I did in Texas and Chicago. And show them the kind of world that is possible, right? I talking about mutual aid. I don't learn about mutual aid till college. I wish I would have learned about it in some way. And so, I think, yeah, part of that is educating the educators and then seeing yourself as advocates.
So this question is for Jorge, but for the panel in general. I think that in some way positions on immigration have hardened across the world. It's a reality. It's what Anthony was describing. I mean, the fact that the Democratic Party that in some ways historically has been more amenable to having a more humane migration policy that oftentimes we criticize because that's not far enough. Being moved to the right, that's a fact of life. So when Mark talks about creativity, I mean, politicians respond to interest. So she's raising an important point, but then creativity means like touching politicians when it hurts, meaning that if they don't do certain things, they're not going to be elected. So the question, I think, it's a fundamental one in the sense that migration pressures are going to increase. We know that. So to me, the answer is public opinion. How do we turn the tide, and how do we? First of all, why did people who are concerned about migration seem to be losing by a lot? By a lot. I think this is a growing trend. And then the second one is how to, in a way, turn the tide. And narratives are a very important issue, but what narratives do really work? I think that humanized migration seems to, in theory, seems to be working. Sorry, let me rephrase that. In theory, it will work. I'm not sure it's working. So, again, if you have any idea of that, because Jorge, you have been thinking about that for since I know you. And it has been a frustrating thing. time for you to understand the reasons, but do you see any way?
It's a major question that I wish I had the answer to. I think that's the conundrum that a lot of immigration organizers find themselves in, right? Where do we spend our energy? Is it on the Detention Watch Network on making sure no new detention centers are built? Is it the narrative? Yeah, is it the narratives around good versus bad immigrant and bringing us? But like, there's just so many ways, and I think art and creativity has always played a key role in the way that organizers respond to this issue or any social justice issue. Whether that is collecting oral history or creating zines, as again has done in the past, or even getting creative in the types of civil disobedience that you participate in, which I think does impact politicians and does it creates opportunities for a response for politicians. I think as I mentioned, right, like a lot of undocumented people, we don't have the power of voting, but that doesn't mean that we don't have the power to participate politically in this country. And that being said, I also think elections provided huge opportunities, right? I'm thinking of the Chicago City Council and all that they've been able to do because of who is in the city council. I'm thinking of last night in Michigan, right? We had over 100,000 people vote uncommitted for the Democratic Party. And so I think there's a lot to say there, and all the examples of people power, art, creativity does have an impact. The final result, we don't know, right? I think that's part of it. I think the other thing that comes to mind is sort of the importance of continuing the work of recalling what's already been done, right? Remembering, like, in order to help with the now, I think is really important. And I think a lot of times, the other thing that I think about is we're talking about the tensions even within the undocumented community. And I think of how important it is to not just put the onus, the responsibility on the undocumented community for doing this type of work, right? All of us should be doing this advocacy. All of us should be asking for work permits and immigration reform. And it makes me think of, I've mentioned this in the past, but it reminds me of a queer Muslim friend who used to organize with us. When she was asked about allyship, she always said, I don't want an ally in front of me, I don't want an ally behind me, I want an ally right next to me in the fight. Because I think, for me, in terms of my own struggles and the struggles that I involve myself in, that's sort of the mindset that I lead with. I know that that's not an answer to your question, because I don't have that answer, right? But I think there's a variety of tactics that have been explored and that we'll continue to explore. And I think part of the art of creativity comes from the type of tactics that we have to actually explore as well.
I can follow up on that. It just strikes me so much of the conversation, whether it's reasons why people are leaving or the realities people face while migrating or when they arrive here in Chicago, have a lot to do with politics that are about migration, but also much more than migration. I'd be curious, I guess, to hear what people's thoughts are, kind of how do migration politics fit into a much broader picture? Because it strikes me that a lot of the tensions that may exist, whether it's within the undocumented community or within Chicago between different groups of people, are based in part on the idea that this is kind of like a zero-sum game. And the pie is a certain size, and if someone's getting something and we're not getting it, well, then we're losing. But refocusing that on kind of a broader politics, people can see the mutual interest and benefit in promoting policies and pushing politicians to implement policies that would be a win-win. It just strikes me that's kind of key to whether it's shifting public opinion or addressing the real needs that people have, because they may be scapegoating migrants, but a lot of times they're speaking from a place of real need and perhaps neglect by politicians at the local, state, or federal level. So how do migration politics fit into a much broader political vision?
Media
how it's in university. So to Adam's great question, that's also something I would ask. The issue of migration within broader questions of like empire and
you mentioned there's a lot of different factors and a lot of different views within the immigrant rights movement. I feel like, and so I think for me, something that comes to mind is like even like being critical, like deconstructing the idea of citizenship, because I feel like acknowledging that this is like a federal colonial like country, the U.S., like by us as a nation, the people asking for citizenship to be part of that project, in a way we are legitimizing that, like listing of land, the possession of people, and all of that. So I think like even being aware of that, like that, like how does that come into play? How does that inform the policies that we push for? It's very tricky. I feel like, especially if we're all trying to like get something, get a work and get a little barrier against like deportation, etc. So I think like it's a lot of like folks that's made like changing the narrative, or like thinking about like digging deeper into like what does that mean, and how does that connect to like also in Palestine, where folks are being displaced, like I think it is all connected, and I think for us that we look at a lot of the enforcement like ICCP, even like acknowledging those connections of like technology that comes out of Israel, issues at the border that later used in the protests and police here in the city, like all of those connections that are happening. I think like, yeah, how does it inform? I feel like there's more possibility to be able to like connect with broader discussions, struggles, solutions to different problems. But I think like overall it's solidarity that like we should be like practicing.
Focus on that concept of solidarity. I think it's something that we collectively as a country have is that we're really gripped by the politics of fear on every side. The right are afraid of being replaced by a new country. The left were afraid of the right. And what we need more than anything is courage in our society. We need the courage to welcome people who need help. We need the courage to start something new. And I think that is fundamentally what we have to practice in our day-to-day life is individualized and consistent courage. And until we get that, we're going to continue to have to feel confident about immigrants, about foreign, about whoever. We have to adapt. Courage.
I don't know if this is really my favorite politics, but I really think about a lot of what's being said among like Mexicans and Venezuelans, like in just different conversations that I've had, like for example, like somebody that is like a temp worker at a factory, and a lot of Venezuelans come from, and so there's the way she like told me about it is that they're very much like afraid of like Mexicans against Venezuelans, and not to say like I agree with that. That's very much how they're framing it. Just thinking like they were thinking and these are all like low-wage workers, but there's like this competition for the same jobs, and in that tangible case, it is true that yeah they're younger, so maybe some of the older Mexicans are not called back. And these are temp workers, so there's like so much security, like responsibility. So there's like this competition for the lowest wage work. So that's just one example, but I do think that, I don't know if that's migration politics, maybe racial politics, of like how people talk about each other, and how sometimes hear Mexicans talk about Venezuelans, and very different ideas of how they think that you should do migration, or you should work hard, but you should not ask for housing. Like you should work hard, and so you can eventually afford an apartment. Like why are they asking for housing if you have to work hard? So like there's always rhetoric that I feel like I hear about this perception that this other group is not doing migration right. We did it right. We worked hard, and we eventually became self-sufficient. And I don't know, there's a lot of perception, and I think there's a lot of sometimes like large stereotyping of what migration looks like for Mexicans and how it's looking like for other people today. But I think there is very much like, I don't know, it's like really good bad immigrants kind of rhetoric to some people sometimes that I hear. And just specifically talking about Mexicans and Venezuela, because I think that's that's probably the population I'm most familiar with, but I think there is so much to unpack there about the different arriving and what situations they arrived in when they got here and how that's changed maybe the dynamic of how you're able to integrate. And I think the arrivals today, I think they're facing challenges that, not to say, oh, that's easy, but I think they're facing challenges that maybe people 20, 30 years ago didn't experience. Really expensive housing, really difficult. I think more difficult, and I'm not making my parents necessarily, but it feels like there's so many challenges to integrate right now for Latin American immigrants. That's just one thing.
Sorry, something to mind. I think like in terms of how they reform, like I feel like there's some benefit from like immigration being such a mess. Because I feel like two examples come to mind, like here in Chicago, when our guys were here, she was trying to pass the budget, like a lot of communities were against. She kind of like used at that point we had in the Welcome to City ordinance in Chicago, there was 4 sections in which police could collaborate with ICE, if you were seeking an injury, if you had a warrant, or having committed a felony, or and so we've been started pushing to get rid of those paragraphs, and she kind of like used that kind of like, oh, I'm gonna pass my budget, but I'm also gonna get rid of the paragraph. So are you okay with it? You know, kind of like using immigration aspect to like pass harmful things that may affect others. So I think that we should be really vocal about that. Of like kind of like the way that it uses immigration to pit us against each other. And also recently at the federal level where they're trying to pass more aid for Ukraine and Israel. That they were like, oh, but like the Republicans, I believe like we're not gonna approve, and it's like border verification, right? So there's always that like vision of like immigration to like either pass more harmful stuff or like get communities to approve or feel okay to certain things. And so yeah, I think that that's also another way that we should be vigilant about be vocal about it.
I think to that point, and to the Palestine cluster, the disturbing cluster conversation going on, it made me think of the Tato mentioned earlier, one of the series from Gonzalez, who wrote Harvest of Empire spoke, and she brought up a really good point, which is that the U.S. budget for foreign aid to Latin American and the Caribbean is $3 billion comparison to the ridiculous amount of money that a foreign aid that is going to Israel. We're talking about 9 million people. This population in Israel is 9 million in comparison to the 650 million people in the Latin American and Caribbean region who are getting this much money. So part of that is also remembering those, like, as we talk about becoming politically engaged, and as we talk about how does the media turn this into something that it's not, right? Like coming back to almost back point of where is the U.S. money actually going, right? We're talking about Latin American and Caribbean being bunch into getting this much in comparison to Israel. And that has a huge impact. I mean, to everything that everyone does.
I just wanted to add that when we think about migration, the politics of migration, we don't have to forget that the people that are arriving in these countries, they have been facing systemic racism in the countries that are in so your question Adam is very important because there's a colonial legacy in Europe targeting certain populations, global style, racialized population, indigenous population, black population. They're the ones that are being targeted as these new populations, and they carry their bodies and their emotions and their memories years and years of being discriminated in the home countries, the first countries that protect them, the second countries that protect them,
about the importance of learning from them. And then you understand that there's a continuum of resistance with their movement against systemic racism, against the way in which colonialism reactivates outward. And it's also the part of the state system. Maybe that's what we have to test. Maybe that's the question, the core question that brought to the conversation. We're doing good states. And the rules of the state apparatus of requirements is founded on targeting these bodies, this particular body. So it's a huge question, but at the same time, in migrant context, they're the ones that are eating, they're the ones that are saving, and they're the ones that are safe, navigating across these stages really shows. So I think that we have so much more to know to that. The last point I want to mention for you is that one that the 28 that Jose was referring to is not forget that those not was the balance, those also do infection, regular use of the not a minor case for Latin America. And second, that yesterday May for the day of that she had also the mark of using one individual using $147,000 in care application for research to belong to the 20% group of population that will be considered in the middle. Right? So imagine the level of inequality when now it's needed like a good life, not too extravagant, because not a lot of things. It's not considered a butterfly, or that you have a house, or that it's $157,000. That creation is not because what is wrong with it. Because it is also the result of creating hospital work, employers getting away with getting arrested, inviting arrested to the bottom. Like erase all the protection from labor, erase like the possibility of organizing or having a union or belonging to a union. So it's tremendous attack on labor that has happened to the only hope that I can invite you to think is that even all those things that happen in the moment in the labor movement is something down, the national fear substitutes otherwise for the station of the interest of the union, the cycles of global you don't know where it's going because it's a little very long and winding road, but maybe we also need to be mindful about how much the lack of our state in the United States has hurt the economic crisis, completely